everyone, welcome to Type Talks. Today we have INTP versus ENTP. And so, Sebastian, would you like to tell us a bit about you?
Of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Sebastian. I am an analyst at a mortgage company. I'm relatively new to typing as in general. I did type as an ENTP with Joyce. So yeah, looking forward to having some good discussions and good dialogue here.
Excellent. And James?
Yep. So my name's James. I live in Ireland. I work as a doctor, and I'm currently studying philosophy from the University of London.
Excellent. Yeah. So Sebastian and James are both typing clients of mine, so I've had the chance to double confirm their type. Yeah. And so today we will be contrasting these two types, and we'll be starting with the dominant function. And so ENTPs lead with the dominant function, extroverted intuition, and INTPs lead with the dominant function, introverted thinking. So Sebastian and James, what are your experiences with your dominant function?
I've always found, and this is probably most people with with most any DOMs will probably have some sort of story that's similar, where you can tell by a very early age that you're able to connect things that other people aren't necessarily as quick to do. So clear like that starts in school, and that's kind of something that I've always enjoyed, and I've always kind of sought to explore and expand within myself, is the fact that I'm able to see something and it reminds me like, oh, this is similar to this, or this connects with that, or maybe this has this effect on this other thing I know. It's kind of like, just as I'm receiving information, immediately like my mind just is automatically like saying like, oh, this looks like that, this looks like that, or these two things are related, these two are connected, these two are contradictory. And then that's kind of sort of the TI then now playing into it. But the initial place my head goes to is, where does this connect with everything else that you know?
Mm-hmm. And how do you think your experience of NE is different than an INTP's?
There are a few people I know that I might consider INTPs, but I'm no expert, so I can't really type them. And to me, it seems that the difference, and one of them is actually the person I'm referring to is one of my coworkers, and I do spend quite a bit of time with him. He'll seem to kind of get stuck in one topic more easily than I am. Whereas for me, the instinct is kind of to, like, as I'm absorbing information and just learning things, looking at the news, whatever, my brain is bouncing everywhere, making connections here and there. If he sees something that's like, ooh, I might be onto something here, it's way easier for him to kind of just focus on that and really explore that idea. Whereas for me, it's more about just like, oh, here's another idea. Here's another idea.
Yeah, that's really well said, Sebastian. There are some scientific studies done on introverted babies and extroverted babies. So introverted babies tend to be more concentrated with their one toy. Like, they tend to have more of an attention span with that one toy. Whereas extroverted babies, they tend to get bored of toys more easily. And I feel like Sebastian explained it in a really great way right now. And so, James, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's Sebastian, when you spoke about your friend and how he can hone in on, like, he gets less carried away with patterns and drawing connections, and he can hone in on specific pieces of information. That's probably the best way I can explain it as well. So for me, I mean, a lot of these processes are unconscious, or subconscious. So you don't, it's not something you kind of analyze actively as it's happening. But what I've noticed since reading more about typing is that when I'm taking part in a conversation, the first thing I notice immediately is anything contradictory that somebody is saying, or if something doesn't make sense for one reason or another. It doesn't have to be contradictory, it just doesn't have to make sense. I kind of have a burning desire to clarify whatever it is that didn't add up or didn't make sense. And it's almost it's kind of experienced as something frustrating, because I can't imagine the conversation continuing until I've made sense of whatever that was. And once those pieces fall into place, then I start considering, patterns, connections, alternative ways of viewing something. Now in terms of when I study something, it's not a case of wanting to understand everything. It's a case of physically feeling as though I need to. I could spend hours on a paragraph of some book that I'm supposed to be reading purely because there was something contradictory in it, and it needs to make sense, or it needs to fit into whatever the bigger picture I have of the topic is. And until I figure out what that specific piece of information is getting at, I won't go any further, which is extremely frustrating, because it means it takes quite a while actually to get certain things finished. But I find that when I eventually get things finished, I tend to have quite a good understanding of what's going on, and a good level of depth of understanding as well. But that's what it feels like. It almost feels like a filter where that information falls through, and if there's a contradictory piece of information or something that isn't adding up, it gets jammed and picked up on straight away, like flagged, I suppose would be a good word. And that's probably the best way I can put it. Something gets flagged, and then that becomes I become obsessive about whatever it is that gets flagged.
Yeah. So introverted functions, especially TI and FI, I call them self-filters. So it kind of needs to filter through that self-process in order for you to let anything really in. So like you said, James, like it has to make sense for you to like absorb it. And so great thoughts, both of you. I'm wondering, how do your functions play out in the real world? So at work, in your relationships?
So at work, I'm pretty good at spotting. I've kind of got like a sort of unique position in my team at work where if there's something new that we have to kind of like get used to, like a new system, we got to learn how to manage or at least change parts of it for our purposes. I'm kind of the first one to take it in because I can put together kind of, all right, well, this is what this system is doing, and that's kind of how it's going to impact our work. So I'm able to kind of see where the correlation is quite easily, and because of my my secondary TI, I'm able to kind of see whether or not that it makes sense. How applicable is it to what we do? Will we get a benefit, or what will the team kind of benefit from adopting the system, or is there something that could be better here maybe in terms of the applications? So it definitely, I would say, I kind of made a long answer, but short answer is kind of it makes me a little bit dynamic in the workplace, because I can see it's definitely a good asset to have. That's as far as my dominant NE goes, right? There are other instances where I could have a negative impact, not necessarily my NE, even though if I do tend to go a little bit too much into tangents, that could be maybe a little negative. But for the most part, it would be my TI, where it's kind of, if I see something that isn't necessarily performing well, or is not working as intended, I could be very quick to kind of point out like, oh, this is not doing well, and I try to say it in the nicest way, but oftentimes it could get mischaracterized as like, oh, that's a little bit insensitive, or you didn't have to be that harsh. So that's kind of how I see a little bit of my functions showing up in the workplace.
Yeah. So thinking types, they're blunt. They tell you when stuff doesn't make sense or doesn't work. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing that I definitely notice is that I am very, in terms of work, and this sounds terrible, but I will literally completely bypass protocol and procedure, purely because I know that consequentially I can achieve the same results, but in a much quicker period of time. And I tend to see those sorts of structures in place as more of a hindrance than a help. So in terms of like, to make that more tangible, So as you can imagine, working in a hospital, there's tons of paperwork. There's tons of, I'm not saying I don't do paperwork. I do paperwork. In terms of hospitals, there's policies for policies. So there's red tape around everything. So where I can get away with avoiding the red tape, I will. Like no doubt about it. I'm not the type of person to get it to take part in what's the best way to describe it? In sort of a standard system, purely because that's the way it is, or that it's been set up that way. If I personally can see a more efficient way of getting around it or doing it, you know, it would be kind of, how can I bend the rules of the established system? Or like, in a sense, it's almost like gaming the system, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you know, what you said there, James, kind of, you know, resonates with me a little bit, because it also, like, you know, what do people define as efficient, right? So you have to look at, obviously, the time it takes for an, I don't know, a given process or whatever to happen. Obviously, that's part of efficiency, but you also have to look at the results, right? So, you know, there's been times, and you just reminded me, like at work, where I'll propose doing something not necessarily in the fastest way, but I will consider it more efficient because the results are more accurate. Yeah. So you also have to take that into account, right? It's kind of like a trade-off, I feel, with those types of.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah. Efficiency, it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. Yeah. And it's the thinkers who tend to use the word efficient a lot. I have a lot of TPs that I interview say that word a lot too. So it's a general T thing, but people tend to associate it with TE. And I can see why, but they do it in different ways. Like TPs and TJs are efficient in different ways.
Let me explain it better. This may make more sense in terms of TI, because this is genuinely how I do it. So let's say you've got a large pool of information, and there could be facts that are seemingly related or unrelated in, you know, a certain discipline. In terms of how I work with those facts or those systems, I try and look for a reductive, like, you know, how can I reduce all of this information into some common theme or some common fact that broadly explains the rest of those facts. So it almost, the information is almost reduced into a framework that efficiently explains all of the information. And when I mean efficiency in terms of like how I view the world and things like that, that is what I mean. So I look for the simplest way of explaining the most amount of the information. Yeah, almost like it's almost the way, you know, a theory in physics might aim to work. You know, so like massive explanatory power in terms of the amount of information that it covers and the depth of predictions that it can make. So that's kind of the way I organize information in general. So it doesn't have to be, you know, book information or study. It could be the way I handle relationships. It could be the way I handle external systems like policy, procedure, protocol, things like that. That's generally the approach I take to most of these things. You know, what can I reduce all of this information down to?
Yeah, to me, it sounds like you're finding the least common denominator, right? It's this will help me because it's common, it's consistent. It can explain very well what I'm seeing in this broad. Right, exactly. Yeah, I totally get you.
Yeah. TI is kind of like it gets rid of all the fluff and it gets to the meat of something.
Yeah. And I tend to, you know, when I read the description of that particular type, and when they talk about it's obvious, the type is labeled in different ways. So like if you do that online test, it can be called I think it's the logician or something like that. If you read that Kiersey book, they describe it as the architect. And I think that one is actually, well, for me anyway, it's a better description because they talk about architect, not necessarily in terms of physical design, but very much in terms of mental design and sort of a framework developing in terms of information that you take in. And I can definitely identify with that. No doubt about it. Like information that comes in gets slotted in where it fits. where it fits most cleanly and contributes to whatever information that I've already acquired. And then that information is brought forward. Now that can be beneficial in a sense that you can use the new information in real world situations, but it can also be difficult bringing a framework with you into new areas of study, because you come in with a huge deal of bias that you're comparing and contrasting all of this new information to, and it can actually make it more difficult to consolidate new information because of the framework that you've built up. So sometimes you kind of have to be less. Sometimes you kind of have to let go of it a little bit in order to be, I suppose, probably the best word is a little bit more open-minded about information that's coming in. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an amazing description, James. So would a way to differentiate ENTP and INTP be that the ENTP is, in a general whole, a little more open-minded than the INTP? Because the INTP will have TI first, so it'll, by nature, be a little more discriminatory towards information.
Yeah, I would say probably from at least the one example I'll use as my coworker, right? And I would say I'm definitely more open to accepting, like, for example, if I'm doing a certain process a certain way and somebody says, oh, this might be more efficient, even though I might have already thought of doing it that way, I might go, okay, let me give it another thought through or something like that, where I feel like if an INTP were to be put in that same scenario where if James had already thought about a certain way of doing something, he's like, it's not optimal. It's going to be a lot harder for him to convince him to, just try it again, or take another look, give it another shot. He's going to be like, no, I already thought it through. It's not.
Yeah, that usually happens. Yeah, but I'm always quite I'm generally quite happy if something, like, of course you're going to bump into people that are going to suggest something to you that's going to make more sense than something that you'd previously come up with yourself. So I'm generally very open-minded in terms of, I always say this, but if it makes sense, logically speaking, I am more than happy to take it on board. But if for some reason sense can't be made of it, then I'm definitely way more reluctant to humor whatever suggestion is being made. But I always want to break down the suggestion, and really hash it out. What sense can be made of this, as opposed to just pushing it away because on a superficial reading it didn't seem to make much sense. I'm always happy to get into a discussion, or allow people to explain their point of view and things like that. Like I find a lot of the time, if I want to learn something new, or if I want to learn something new, sometimes it just takes a long discussion, in terms of what someone else knows versus what you know, and then you can come to some kind of a compromise if that's possible. Yeah.
Great points, James. And so things need to make sense for you, down to why you have to put the towel in a certain place. Can you go into that?
Yeah, this is something I won't say too loudly. But without using that specific example, let me try convey. So this is one of my biggest pet peeves, and this is something that frustrates me way more than it should, is when people tell me to do something, or tell me I should do something, some kind of a prescriptive claim that seems totally arbitrary, and purely because either that's the way it's been done for the past 50 years, or that's the way society conducts itself. Things have to make logical sense in order for me to get on board with it. Now, that's a good thing and it's a bad thing. Obviously, you're going to come across as stubborn if you and argumentative if you constantly get into debates about why things are arbitrary, or because a lot of people don't think that these things are arbitrary. This is the way they have conducted themselves for many years, and not necessarily thought about it, but this is a normal part of life for many people. So an example might be, so Joyce, you mentioned the example of a towel or something like that. So like things in a house go in certain places, right? That's generally the way society looks at things. So specific things go in a kitchen, specific things going in a sitting room. The bedroom contains specific items. And I mean, not everyone is like this, but people who like to keep orderly houses are definitely like this. If something from one room ends up in a room that it shouldn't go in, and take all of these things in inverted commas, this can cause huge grief. Or if the bed isn't made in the morning or something like that, that's another thing. You're not getting anywhere by saying, well, why does the bed have to be made every morning? What is it about the bed that requires its making every morning? And it's oftentimes the replies that you're getting are purely appeals to tradition, because you're supposed to make the bed in the morning, or you're not supposed to put the bathroom towel on the towel rack in the kitchen, and dishes are supposed to be washed after they're used, something like that. Whereas for me, I tend to think very consequentially. So as long as the dishes get washed, I don't see why it should matter when they get washed. Or in terms of a bed, I mean, what specifically about a bed being tidy creates such a burning desire in some people? These are obviously, the examples sound stupid, but they're, the point is kind of to extrapolate from them and put them in context of real world scenarios, not just ones that you come across in a house, but or in work, things are done a certain way. You have to. School is actually a really good example. So like, I don't know what schools are like in North America, or Canada, but like, for some reason we learned joint writing for years in school. Like, we just had to write a specific way. And this was like in, I don't know what the exact equivalence is, but it would be like first grade, second grade in your terms. And it just seemed completely pointless that you were required to write using joint handwriting for years on end, because that just, it looked good. That was the reason why. It's nice to have nice handwriting. Whereas someone like me sees handwriting in terms purely of its function. Handwriting is to convey information, right? As long as it's remotely legible, and that'll tell you how bad my handwriting is. But as long as it's remotely legible, that's the function of handwriting, right? But I think reality is full of those little quirks, right? That things are just like that because this is the way they've always been, and it's difficult to fit in when, for some reason, all of those things seem completely arbitrary and pointless and forced upon people. I don't know, Sebastian, if you can relate to that, or if you've.
Yeah, definitely. I can. I totally feel where, like, I've started countless arguments, especially like in my teenage years, with parents or just people is like, you should do this because of and then the reason is just completely arbitrary. I'm like, well, but there is no reason to it. It's just, that's just because you did it like that. Why do I have to do it like that? Does that make sense? Like, what if I don't do it? What will happen? That's always been my question. It's like, if it doesn't get done how you say it gets done, what's going to be the bad consequence, right? Yeah. So it's that and that's always been something that I've learned to, like, kind of control as I've gotten older, right? You can't just just straight up question people, because some people will take it as your where I'm really just trying to, like, attack the idea, not necessarily the person trying to tell me, right? Because it for the most part, the person would be trying to tell you something. They're doing it out of generally the kindness of their heart, trying to tell you a piece of advice that they think might benefit you, right? So definitely, tons of arguments started because of that. Exactly. It's like, well, that's not a good enough reason to me. Like, you have to make it make sense. Like, yeah, that might be good enough for you, but it's not a good enough. Like, I need to see the consequence here. And I don't see it how you're explaining it to me.
It's something else I've noticed as well, is that when you approach those scenarios, so let's say someone wants you to do something a specific way, because that's the way it's always been done. This might be something you can identify with as well, but I never approach examples like that as though that's the only example. It's always in context of the much bigger picture that is, an appeal to tradition, or the societal structure in which that particular prescriptive claim rears its head. It's never just one example, because you can, I mean, logically speaking, you can clearly imagine that this isn't the first time this has happened. This happens all the time, right? That certain things are just expected of people within a society. And I'm not sure everybody approaches those scenarios like that, right? So they might say, people might look at you and say, I'm literally just asking you to, wash your dishes immediately after you've eaten off them. Why is that something that you want to have a debate about or have a discussion about or something like that? And I think that may be one of the reasons why, because for many people, it's an isolated example. It's not really interpreted in terms of a much bigger context, like the societal structures in which it, is clearly part of or dictated by it. And I don't know if that's, like Joyce, I don't know if that's a quality that's related to intuition over like sensing or something like that, or...
This is a quality of NPs. NPs are
Okay.
known for questioning rules, questioning all those rules and why they're there. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, oftentimes, like when I think about these specific incidences, they often boil down to claims of competing interests. So person X wants something done a specific way because that's the way they want it done. Person Y refuses to do it that way or won't do it that way because the specific act itself doesn't make sense. And it's actually just going to come down to competing interests. Someone's not going to be happy. The person who does the act that they consider arbitrary won't be happy if they do it. The person who wants the other person to do the act purely because, that's the way things are done, they're not going to be happy if the person doesn't do it. So it's literally just who's going to cave, who's going to give in and do it. But it's interesting. The funny thing is that anytime I'm presented with a reason, for why something should be done that actually makes sense, no problem. No problem at all. It just needs to make sense.
Yeah. And right, it doesn't necessarily have to be obvious to me, right? But like if I'm doing something that I think it's like, well, this is not optimal, and then somebody explains like, oh no, this is why we're doing it like this, because if not, then this here malfunctions, so you have to do this extra step in between. It's like, okay, that totally makes sense. All right, I'll just do it like that now.
Yeah. Or if the reason you shouldn't do something is because it could be hurtful,
right?
Or you shouldn't do this because I don't, that person's not going to like that. And that's another sort of like, I think like a red light flashes in my head when somebody says that, because it sounds abrupt, but I don't often consider feelings before I consider facts and things like that. So they tend to be, of secondary consequence, and factored in after I would make a decision about facts and things like that, which is often quite difficult. If you work in a hospital, obviously with patients, and other staff members, that can be quite tricky, because a large part of the decision-making process actually occurs on the basis of how other people are going to feel about the decisions that get made, which for me is very, very tricky, because they're way down the list of things that I consider when I make a decision on something. And that's hard. That's a hard part of working life, actually, is the fact that you're dealing with people all the time. And one of the reasons I actually ended up getting into philosophy, on top of a genuine interest in it, it's because it's just me and my laptop, typing whatever interests me, and I can make sense of it all in my head. It doesn't have to get run by people. I don't have to think about, how is this going to make this person feel, or it's purely what I want to do, which I find, it's just like a breath of fresh air.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a breath of fresh air for you to be away from people, James.
Certain kinds. Conversations like this, no. I really enjoy these sorts of conversations. But there just aren't that many of them on offer, unfortunately. Yeah. Joyce, yeah. I occasionally look over. I can see you smiling as we're talking, and I'm wondering what it is that you're if that's making you giggle.
Yeah. I'm just enjoying how articulate you both are. And so, James, you were talking about how you don't care about having clean handwriting, because as long as it gets across the function, then it's fine. And I'm like, that's such like the doctor stereotype of having like a certain type of handwriting. Yeah.
Oh, it's very bad. It's very very bad. My handwriting. Thankfully, we type more often than right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think James kind of like led us into a pretty good segue to talk about the our inferior functions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He did mention, he doesn't put, or it's for him kind of like how, other people's feelings is kind of, I wouldn't say it's not important, but it's not the pressing matter, right?
Yeah.
It's not the forefront, concern, which I think speaks to, FE being his last stack.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like, for me, I feel like that's something that I've definitely been able to work on. It didn't come very naturally to me either, to kind of, think to myself like, all right, I'm in a social situation and I'm interacting with other people. They might feel a certain way if I said this in this way, or if I pointed this out in a certain, manner. But I feel it did come a little bit easier to actually, once I was, conscious of it, and, well, this is kind of how people feel. Or these statements make people in general feel attacked or discredited or something like that. Then it was quite easy for me, and I think I've got a pretty good developed FE, where I can, I can say what my TI wants to say in a way that's not, that doesn't come off as insensitive.
Okay.
And I feel like that's very much ingrained into my process. Whereas for kind of said, James, to you, it's a remainder sort of after the process, the thinking process. It's kind of like a residual. Whereas for me, it's kind of like part of the thought process before what I'm like, as I'm forming what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Yeah, I think I probably need to spend more time trying to develop that particular function, because I actually find I kind of get into these bizarre situations where I say something that I in my head sounded really benign, like it was just a comment about something specific, and then I'm shocked to find that it was taken not necessarily in an offensive way, but to mean something else.
Right. Yeah.
I always kind of think, and then I work through like hypothetical scenarios in my head. It's kind of like this deductive process where I'm like, even if you thought that I said this particular thing, what would be the big deal about it? You kind of work through the various possible meanings it could have had, and it still sounds benign. And then, but I mean, I obviously don't have, a tape to listen to myself or watch what it is that I've said.
Right.
But I often find myself getting into those scenarios where you're kind of like, you can't say things like that. That's kind of the quote. You shouldn't say those sorts of things, or as though somebody literally just died in the room or something like that. And I'm kind of thinking, I'm at a loss oftentimes as to what it was that I said, or or could have said differently, something like that. Because the funny thing about me is that if I'm in the presence of someone who's very, very emotional, which you can imagine working in a hospital, thankfully it hasn't happened very often, actually, in terms of patients. But when it does happen, it's almost like a freezing situation where I'm kind of sitting there going, oh, like in my head, thinking, I literally don't know what to say or do. Like it's kind of like you can solve problems in terms of giving a diagnosis or treating a patient, something like that. But in terms of the emotional aspect of it, it's like nothing comes to mind. Like just no word comes to mind, or gestures come to mind. It's very, very difficult to know. Well, for me personally, I don't know what it is, but I don't have like a natural consoling instinct, I guess is probably the best way to put it. I kind of just freeze and don't really know what to do or say. I kind of just wish it hadn't happened. That's kind of how I feel about in scenarios like that. I don't know if maybe you've gotten better at that, or you were always good at that. I don't know, Sebastian, but
no. So I would agree. I don't think that's something that I was particularly good at, or that's not something that comes natural to me. But it is something that I've kind of picked up with age. So it's just kind of something I've learned is just what would people want to hear. So I kind of envision, like, if I were in this situation, I would want my friend to probably say this, or if I was presented, this is kind of the reaction I would want when I tell people. So that's kind of like the barometer that I tend to go off of. Right, but it's definitely something that I have to think about though as well, because it's and this is where the part that it's like it doesn't come naturally, because I feel like I have to think through how I would feel in that situation. So there is kind of like this, like you said, you're at a loss, and for me certainly, like if I'm for example, a couple of weeks ago, I was with my friend and her aunt died. She got the news that her aunt died when she was in France. And then, she started crying. So obviously, like, oh, I'm so sorry to hear about your loss, like it. And, I try to be careful. Like, some people might get, really emotional, really upset if you try to ask them, about I never met my friend's aunt, but, if you try to ask them about their loved one that passed, like, they might not be ready or something like that. So, I try to like play around with kind of like, I might ask a question, and if they seem, just too lost, then I'll hold off on the questions. But my go-to is probably like, well, what can you tell me about the person? Like, try to bring up happy memories of them, sort of, is kind of like my response. But it's not something that naturally, that's what I do now, like, presented in that, if I was in that situation, but it's not something that I would have done. I probably, in my, before thinking through, like, okay, so what would happen, or how would I feel if I was in this situation? How would I want people to act towards me? Then, that is a process. And before I've kind of figured out what my reaction would be, or what I would want other people's reactions to be, if I find myself in that place, I would be at a loss until I can figure that out and think through it.
Yeah. So thinkers tend to have a little bit more difficulty with being emotional, tapping into like emotionally high charged situations, and it's kind of awkward for thinkers maybe, or they're at a loss sometimes. Yeah. And James, you talked a bit about inferior FE and how sometimes you'll say something and you'll look around you and it's kind of like a crime scene. Like you'll see like people's reactions to you. It's like, wait, what did I say? A lot of inferior FE people talk about this, where they'll hand that introverted thinking TI truth taco, and then they'll react to what's been said. But really, like, TI is kind of viewing the statement in a kind of like valueless way. So it's just
Totally.
saying it. And then other people
Totally.
interpret it as value laden.
Yeah. Yes, my sister, this is funny, like my sister, she took the test recently. I gave, Joyce, if you don't mind, I gave her the email that you sent me when you typed me, because I knew that'd be the best way to do it, or at least the most validated way to do it. And she came out as an INFP. And I thought this was really, really interesting, because we're quite alike in many ways, but she can never approach a situation without having some kind of a way of looking at it in terms of like value or morality, or whether something is just, she's very, very firm in terms of what she thinks is right and what she thinks is wrong. And she's extremely sensitive to the way certain things are put, even just non-verbal gestures, like the way a person would move their hand, or a facial appearance or something like that. And she thinks she very much approaches situations in terms of whatever her values and feelings and things are. And that's the area where we always clash, because whenever we get into a discussion, and we have many of them, it might be a discussion about politics or science or something like that, she always criticizes me for overlooking the value side of things, or the rightness of a situation, or the wrongness of a situation. Whereas I'm largely just concerned with, how the information adds up, whether it's consistent, are there facts of the matter? Do we know, whether or not there's a piece of information to support a certain claim that she might make? And she tends to base a lot of her reasoning on like a hunch or a feeling that she has that she can't quite put her finger on, which for me is very difficult to understand because, when I think about doing something or I'm taking in information, I think in terms of reasons. This is why this happened, or this is why I would do this. Whereas for her, a lot of the time she finds it hard to articulate those points of view. I don't know if is that something to do with maybe the inferior function as well, or no?
Yeah, so that's the difference between introverted thinking, TI, from FI, introverted feeling. Introverted feeling, it kind of listens to its heart or its soul, whereas the TI will listen to rationality and like what makes sense and the reasons behind things. Yeah.
And then in terms of the, I'm not going to, well, I'll have to use the word now so people know what I'm talking about, but crime scene. It sounds so much worse than it is, but that happens. I'm not going to say a lot, but it happens enough that you tend to shy away from conversation actually when that happens quite frequently, because a lot of the time it's unpredictable. You can't actually understand why it's happened. And if you can't understand why something has happened, then it makes it harder to prevent the thing from happening. Yeah, that happens that happens once a week, a couple of times a month.
Yeah, like I agree with my INTP friends. Sometimes they'll say a statement that is just so shocking, or this is just TI in general too. And Sebastian?
Yeah, and when it happens, it's kind of one of those. I hate being misinterpreted. Like it's one of my I don't like it at all. Which is why I try to be as concise when I talk to people. I'm like I want to be very precise so that there's very little room to misinterpret what I'm saying. And then what's funny is that then I almost always use avoid absolutes. So I'll try to say stuff like, oh, generally, or almost always, or almost never, right? Because I don't like being misinterpreted, and I don't like saying stuff that's incorrect, that I know is incorrect, or that I don't know for a fact that it's true.
Yeah. A lot of my perceiver friends, they'll say qualifying statements because perceivers in general, they like to leave things open-ended. So that means like when they have an insight, they'll also like to leave it a little open-ended. And that's how they do it through speech. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was thinking about, this is just something I've read. So that book that you sent me, Joyce, I think it's by AJ Drent. Is that the book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So he talked about the way an inferior FE can manifest in an INTP, and he said that it can manifest itself in terms of the projects that INTPs want to get involved in. So they don't tend to enjoy working in emotionally charged environments, but they often want whatever project they're working on to have an impact in terms of humanity and the betterment of society and things like that. And that's something I can definitely identify with. I definitely prefer to work on my own and just kind of be alone with my own thoughts and get them down on a piece of paper or my laptop, and then think about what the thoughts themselves or the piece of information could do. But it's often in context of the much bigger picture. How much of a difference could something like this make? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a difference in terms of like an immediate difference in terms of the well-being of people. It could be like an indirect difference, but it's often a project that can be expanded at the level of a society or something like that. I don't know if that's something that you're familiar with or.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And what I see that as is like INTPs, when they want to add something to the world, sometimes it's more of a solo project. They like to do it on their own apart from people. And then when they're done to give it to people. Whereas I think an ENTP might be a little more involving with other people in general.
Yeah. I would say that's probably true. And I think that's probably comes out of just knowing that, because how I tend to think is, let's try to do a little bit of everything. I know that, we're never really going to, unless I get other people on board, we're never going to really hammer out that one thing we started, because we're going to just keep trying to do all the other things that keep popping in my head.
Yeah. So Sebastian, do you try to start things and then get people on board so they can finish what you started? So then you don't have to. I don't know.
What's funny is at work kind of now, yeah, I'm starting to, where it'll be like tasks that I'm like, what would be cool? We would be cool if we had something like this. And now, well, we're currently trying to grow the team. So I think it's possible in the future that there would be people kind of reporting to me. So that would be, something that I could probably, be like, what would be cool? This idea would be cool if we had something like this. And then I can get somebody to work on it and, see the project through.
Yeah.
Instead of,
So
having like a half-started report on my desktop for like a month.
yeah, I have an ENTP friend, and Sebastian's also my friend. But yeah, they're really good at innovating and finding new ideas. Like they're good at like imagining new ideas, but the finishing part they're not as good at. So what's great is like I had an ENTP friend. He's like, oh yeah, you know what's great for everyone? Like everyone could be doing this, and then he never got started. But I'd imagine if he did, then it would become something really great. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because that ENTP friend, their natural impulse was to make it a little bit collaborative or to imagine other people and in it too. Whereas I think the INTP is more a loner. No, wait, that's a bad.
But it's totally true. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I much prefer if I've always said this, because in hospitals it's a team-based profession. I much prefer to work on my own, or if I have some time to squeeze in some study, those moments where I can just be by myself in the library, I really enjoy that. Yeah. And the when Sebastian was talking about people, kind of reporting to you, like you would be, their supervisor, if that's the correct word. That's not something I enjoy at all. That is just right at the bottom of my list in terms of what interests me. I kind of, because I'm so autonomous myself, I probably inadvertently expect the same of other people, that they're just doing what they're supposed to do. And I don't even know if I would have the skill set to project manage other people's work. I wouldn't consider myself a leader type, if that makes sense. I'm much more of a troubleshooter, creative input than organizing and structuring.
Yeah, and that's probably something that those are some similar thoughts that I have as well, where it's like, well, I'm not sure if I would be like the best manager to oversee a project, but in the times that I have been put in like a position of leadership, I don't know what I do until I get in there and do it. So that's kind of like how I it's not necessarily like that big a worry. Like obviously, because I'm not as organized as like, let's say, a J would be. That's going to be a limit to anything that I'm managing per se. But I think because I'm adaptable, then it's not a fear of mine if I were to be put in that position.
Yeah. EPs, they have a fluidity and adaptability with the external world, so they're less overwhelmed than an IP would be of those type of things. Also, with ENTPs, they more like to like bounce ideas off of other people when they're there around them. Like my ENTP friend will always bounce new ideas around with me, whereas my
Guilty.
INTP yes, yeah. That's why when they have a new innovative idea of how to do things, like they'll tell me about it and I'll be like, oh, interesting. But I'll always hear about it like these. And then the next week they'll be like, I have this other idea. Amazing. Yeah, the any is just constantly generating. Yeah, whereas INTPs tend to, they do bounce ideas off of me, but it's not as much as the ENTP.
Joyce, when I kind of troubleshoot ideas to people, I don't make it explicit, but I'm genuinely bouncing ideas off people to see can they provide an objection that I haven't already thought about. So it could be a position about anything. It could be an opinion about something in the news or politics or philosophy or medicine or it. I think it comes across as though I'm looking for advice or I'm looking for help, but actually it's just, can you offer me any interesting insight that I haven't kind of thought of myself? Or can you provide me with an objection to some argument that I put forward that I haven't thought of myself? So I tend to kind of use people to bounce ideas off them purely to test my own, if that makes sense. Not because I'm overly concerned with the input that they might have. It's purely to test my own ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point, James. And so introverted functions, they kind of like to bring their own agenda to the table. So what James was saying is that he likes to bounce ideas, but he already has this like TI agenda that it's for to refine his TI. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then if I'm offered something, this is obviously very subjective, and I like it. At the risk of sounding arrogant, it's not supposed to sound arrogant. It's more because I mean, many of the things I'm interested in are totally, niche, and like 90% of people would find them boring. But on the occasion where somebody has something quite insightful to say that I hadn't thought of myself, they're the kind of people that I'm quite happy to spend a bit more time around. So I used to attend these discussion groups when I lived in Australia, and there would be, it would vary in number, but it could be 5 to 10 people. But there were always two particular guys that would go, that we would always, so like the discussion might start at 7 o'clock, it would finish at 9. The three of us would sit there till midnight, 1 a.m., just debating, in conversational terms about all sorts of things. And eventually we just started catching up ourselves outside of the group. And the interesting thing was we did, one particular guy had a degree in physics and theology, and the other guy had a degree in computer science and philosophy. And they were also familiar with the MBTI, the functions and things like that. And one guy was an ENTP and the other guy was an INTJ. And in the 5 years I spent in Australia, and all the people that I met, they were the only two people that I can genuinely say I enjoyed spending time with and, discussing things with. Yeah.
Oh.
No, it wasn't. Sorry, Joyce, that upset you a bit.
No. That was like so cute. It's adorable how you're able to find like your tribe, because you talk a lot about being a loner and how you like being alone. And
it took 5 years.
Yeah. Because your statement there, what it says is that it's a product of society, that it's not really like you want to be alone. It's really just because there's no one to really talk to. There's a certain type of catharsis in finding the people who can talk about the things that you love with you. And for some people, they might find it in a moment in their life, like you did, James. But I wondered about like people who never find that in their life. I bet there are a lot of people like that too. So I was thinking about like, like it's tragic how it's not everywhere for you, but it's also nice how you were able to find your groupies. Yeah, your NT groupies.
Yeah, and the other thing I was thinking about as well is this was actually before my sister took the test. I always enjoy the conversations that we have because she's able to provide me with this really deep emotional perspective that I like. It's just a blind spot, that I have, but she's always able to put it in terms that make a lot of sense. When she, she's that person who kind of thinks about everyone in the family, if that makes sense. So like we have family groups in our WhatsApp or whatever kind of platform that we use to catch up. And I'm very much the person who kind of posts the least. I'm the kind of person who I may not, I could text my mom every so often, or friends every so often, but I could go off the radar for 2 or 3 weeks. And someone might text me and say like, I literally haven't heard from you in 3 weeks. Are you still alive or something like that? But she's able to provide very intricate emotional aspects to scenarios that I would never have thought to think about. And it's actually only through her that our family keep in regular contact in WhatsApp and things like that, because she's so good at that. And I know when you were talking about like the how did you put it, the NT groupies or something like that, it's something that I've noticed in NFs as well. They can offer really, really interesting, keen emotional insight that for me I find interesting purely because it's new information. It's knowledge that I didn't previously have that I can now add to whatever knowledge I've already built up. And it's like I say, it's a complete blind spot. So it's not the kind of thing that I'm likely to find by myself anyway, if that makes sense. It's complementary, I suppose, would be a good way to put it.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said there, James. Because and similar relation with my sister, right? Because she's an ENFP. So, you know, the conversations that or the input that she gives and whenever we're talking about, you know, any topic is usually it's different from something that I would think of. And that's kind of like the way to put it. It's like, well, this is a kind of like another variable that I kind of got to factor into my equation of the world, right? It's like I was not accounting for this. Now I kind of got to account for it. And, you know, it's pretty cool because I mean, I like learning new things and I like, you know, discovering unknowns and, you know, just exploring.
Yeah, that's lovely. What made me emotional about that was that it's preventable disengagement. So a lot of people, they live their life in a constant state of disengagement, but they don't know why. But like type gives you a way to kind of explain it. You're like, oh, the reason why I'm disengaged in regular conversation, it was because of that. I don't know, there's a type of therapeutic quality to be able to pinpoint what it is in a term or in a phrase. Yeah, sorry, that was off topic. And so
but it's true what you said, right? I feel like, you know, we do that in so many other aspects of life where, you know, like they could be like non-personal as well. Go back to school, right? Like, okay, here's your math problem, go through the steps. Oh, see, this is where the issue is. All right, at least now you have more clarity, right? In that, as far as that, whatever it is you were trying to do in math. But now, you know, you can apply that to yourself, right? As a person, it's like, well, why is it that this is happening? And then, you know, exactly, typing can provide like, oh, I can identify it. It's probably this, or it's somewhere in this, you know, range here. Like, okay, now that gives me at least more clarity, and, you know, it allows you to reflect a little better.
yeah, and this video gives us a lesson. So if you have like an INTP or an ENTP in your life and they're debating you with something, then maybe it's to check if the rule makes sense. Because if they're questioning it, it's because in their frame of reference, there's something arbitrary about it. And so if you really want to love your INTP or ENTP the best way you can, it's to like explain to them like why they should be doing things that certain way. Because when a person doesn't understand that, what can happen is they'll just dismiss why you're questioning things. But to get that like psychological release, like someone actually like understands you, it's for them to actually tell you why it's like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly, for me, I definitely find I'm more drawn to people who I find interesting, if that makes sense. Like they say things that offer me a new perspective or a new way of thinking about a particular problem that I might have thought about, or maybe a problem that I hadn't been thinking about, but actually, you know, that would be worth thinking about. I find those people quite interesting. I'm drawn toward those people. I find that more satisfying than somebody saying thank you, or, you know, buying me a gift, or, you know, doing something romantic in the traditional sense, if that makes sense. I find I'm much more intrigued, and my attention is definitely much more captivated when I find the person that I'm involved with say something that I think is quite interesting or unique or insightful or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So personality hacker would call that intuitives. They tend to value speed and depth of insight. So James, when you hear someone with a new perspective, that's like offering you speed and depth of insight. Whereas like sensing tends to prefer reliability and verifiability of information. So it'll be more about facts and exchanging facts with people. Whereas like intuitives want to exchange, I don't know how to explain it. Concepts. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if this might be something people could identify with, but you tend to grasp conversation very quickly, and you can see the underlying threads and the patterns that are happening in the conversation. And that for me is kind of, unless we're having a conversation like this, where we can explore things in more detail, but for everyday kind of standard conversation, I'm not overly interested in going beyond the general concept or gist of whatever it is that we're talking about. And this can be a point of frustration for me, because for a lot of people, they require sort of, when you're having a conversation, they're not just happy with the concept. They want illustrative examples, and it seems like the point gets labored over and over again by people swapping stories, or about the particular topic of conversation. Whereas for me, when you illustrate something, you're merely describing the concept that has already been grasped. You're not actually offering anything new in terms of, another way to interpret the concept, or how we can relate this particular concept to another one. It just seems to be, a circular example over and over and over again of this particular thing that we're talking about. And that I lose interest very quickly then in terms of conversation. And that's something I think that people who are censors, if I'm using the term correctly, they tend to prefer much more detail and illustrative examples in conversation, that I've noticed. Anyway, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's something that I personally have noticed. Whereas for me, it's more of a, in everyday conversation, I prefer more of a superficial concept level input.
Yeah, that's really, really well said, James. And so I was wondering, what are some points of difference you see between the two personalities before we end the panel? So just any rapid fire points, maybe like some ideas of where you see the differences.
Something I've noticed about Sebastian anyway is you seem very friendly, very warm. You smile a lot, and you seem quite confident when you speak and things like that. So I definitely think that may be a difference. ENTPs might be a bit more personable and maybe more engaging in terms of warmth and that sort of thing. Whereas for me, I think I probably wouldn't come across very sociable and friendly, and yeah, I suppose that's one of the things that I've noticed.
Yeah, so to kind of put what James just said, like in other words, right? It'd be like, so what I would notice, and I haven't, I've spoken with James for two of these type talks now, but if I use my coworker, who I'm pretty sure is an INTP as well, and as a reference, right, if let's say our manager had a choice of, like, one of us has to present in front of a meeting, in front of, like, managing directors, then he'd probably ask me to kind of present it, instead of my coworker, because it does come a little bit more naturally to me to kind of, like, read the room and kind of see, like, are they following, are they not following. I can definitely, like, go down a rabbit hole and lose everybody rather quickly, but I feel like I'm more trained in kind of, like, just, oh, okay, let me take a step back and catch everybody up as well, right? So yeah, I feel like in that sense that there's a difference between the types where ENTPs are probably more personable, can talk about more of a breadth of topics. Like our interest isn't necessarily as devoted to a certain issue or a certain topic or a certain field. We can dabble here and there. Like I can see why people like chemical engineering just as easily as I can see why people like genetics or arts, architecture, something like that, right? And it's easy to find those things, and then once I can kind of understand, right, like, oh, this is the appeal of this, it's easier for me to relate to people who have that, even though they're not particularly my interest. It is easy because I do have interests to kind of, I understand, like, oh, I know why you feel, I know how you feel about this because that's how I feel about this other thing. And it makes it easier to kind of relate to people in that way. But I think I'm kind of trying to, like, give an explanation, because it's not something that comes natural, right? It's something that I've kind of thought through. It's like, this is how I feel about things I like, and I'm assuming this is how other people feel about things they like. So when they're telling me about the things they like, I'm like, oh, okay, so maybe they're really excited about this one part. Maybe I should ask them a question about it. That's kind of how I go. That's kind of how the process is in my head.
Yeah, with extroverts. So what Sebastian said just now is something I hear from a lot of extroverts is they have an ease with talking about things that may not be their immediate circle of interest. So extroverts tend to be more adaptable with a wide range of topics. Like whatever you're interested in, they can figure out a way to kind of turn the conversation in a way that they'd be more into it, if that makes sense.
Like kind of meet you there. You know what I mean? It's like so if I know like that the topic of conversation is headed here, I can kind of meet you there. And you know, it works like something that I'm not the biggest fan of, but I think I'm pretty good at is small talk. Like, you know, if we're killing time before a meeting or something, you know, like what are the go-tos? Like I can talk to you about sports, I can talk to you about the weather, you know, just stuff like that. And even though I'm not like, you know, following the Weather Channel religiously, or I'm not, you know, reading up ESPN and checking what the latest score lines are, I can, you know, recognize that, you know, there is an interest. Like I can see why that's interesting to it. Like, you know, obviously I can see why the weather would be interesting to people because you got to live in a place, right? I can see why sports would be interesting to a lot of people as well. I can see why, you know, like just recently, like the Super Bowl halftime show, I can see why a lot of people would pay attention to that as well. So, you know, it's even if I don't necessarily see it, I'm perfectly fine holding a conversation about like, you know, the Super Bowl because, you know, I can ask like, oh yeah, and how did it score? I have some knowledge of football, you know, like and it's stuff like that that I feel comes more it's easier to build as an ENTP than it would be as an INTP. But I would be hesitant to say that it would come naturally because I don't feel like it did it. It feels like it's something that I kind of had to develop as I got older.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm the exact opposite. So I'm the guy hoping that I don't have to engage in conversation, or in fact, I wouldn't say I try very hard, but I would try reasonably hard to make myself seem less personable, purely so I don't have to engage in that conversation. Yeah.
That's quite the strategy, James.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I would prefer that someone not want to talk to me, and potentially even just potentially even just not like me. I would prefer that than having to make small talk with that person on a regular basis. Yeah.
Yeah. Introverts, they're more protective of their energy. INTPs will be more stingy with their energy than ENTPs on a whole, because extroverts tend to have a little more energy on a whole than introverts. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have no issue just sitting there and saying like virtually like nothing.
Yeah, and I totally understand because if I'm in a room, you know, with somebody that you know, there's no conversation to be had, I'm totally fine, you know, sitting quietly, eat the people doing whatever it is that they're doing, right? Carry on with as you were.
Yeah, but it's a cool micro expression that you mentioned, James, because Sebastian does smile when he talks. Like as Sebastian's talking, he'll smile and talk, which is very ETP of him. It's the FE third slot. Yeah. I'm wondering, James, how deep does your TI go? How thorough are you with your TI?
When you say thorough, do you mean you just have to kind of, do you mind just expanding on that a little bit?
Like, how far does the rabbit hole go down? I guess, like.
Oh, I don't think it ends. Like I mean, I don't know. Like to give a specific example. Like I mean, today I spent. So I'm studying. I'm doing a metaphysics module as part of my philosophy program, and I'm studying. Some of the questions that come up are on Hume's theory of causation. So I came across a particular sentence in one of the pieces that I'm reading, and so I've gone way beyond the recommended reading. So I've covered the topic in, I would say, 4 different books, and I've read the Stanford, like everything the Stanford Encyclopedia has, and I've covered a fair number of academic papers from the college library. And on top of that, I got today sidetracked on a particular line that that I had been trying to figure out, because if the particular sentence means something else, then it changes everything in terms of the theory that we're talking about. It's just worded a very specific way. I would say I spent 4 or 5 hours just reading through papers to try and figure out what the correct meaning was. But that happens on a regular basis. So I don't know if that's a TI particular thing, but in terms of like a rabbit holes, yeah, that there's no end. Yeah.
Yeah, that's TISI. So you're trying to figure out like the precise meaning of a word. Yeah, the etymology, the origin of a word. That's very SI too.
Yes, and I never approach I never feel satisfied if I'm studying a piece of information that I'm interested in and all I have is a superficial understanding. I feel like it almost feels fraudulent not to go and understand every aspect of the particular problem that I'm reading. I don't know how to describe it. Maybe I'm not describing it well. That's kind of the experience, what it's like. In terms of like clarity and contradictions and the things that people say. So like somebody could say something like that anyone else would find really insulting, like just some really, really offensive remark. And I would probably forget about it within seconds. If somebody directed something like that toward me, it would literally just roll off my back. I wouldn't think about it at all. But if somebody said something hypocritical or put forward some kind of a statement or an opinion that was self-contradictory, and despite explaining this to them, they just couldn't see it, that would really, really frustrate me. Like, I wouldn't necessarily show it, the frustration, but that would drive me nuts. Whereas things that typically drive people nuts, like rudeness or bad behavior or saying something offensive, those sorts of things don't even feature. I'm whatever the opposite to sensitive is, like that's me. So I don't know again, maybe if they're TI things, I'm not sure, but the things that keep me up at night are not the things that keep everybody else up at night.
Yeah. I have an INTP friend where he's like, offensive is a word for feelers, because he doesn't get offended.
No, not at all. And I'm always confused when people say, "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean it that way," or "I didn't mean to ask that question. Do you mind? I shouldn't have said that, or shouldn't have." I literally have no idea what they're talking about. In a way, it's good because nothing is off bounds in terms of conversation. Like, I will literally have a conversation about anything, and I will not take anything personally. So that is, that's clearly helpful to a degree as well. But it's obviously helpful. It's obviously unhelpful when you assume that other people might be the same.
Yeah, I'll always enjoy it when it's when I can talk to other intuitives, because you can have a sort of more detached conversation. You can think conceptually. You can talk, hypothetically and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Wow. Thank you for allowing us to be in your mind for a while, James, and letting us know that. Yeah, TI tends to notice hypocrisy really quickly, because it's like, oh, what you said contradicted with this statement. But then what does that mean then? Like, there's a hole in the logic.
Oh yeah, and if it takes any longer than I'm willing to spend time on in trying to explain it, I just give up. And like I tend to just kind of shut down if it's not, because a lot of the time people can understand what's happening, but through stubbornness or ego or emotional reasoning, they don't want to admit when they're wrong or something like that. Whereas, of course, everyone is wrong at points. I say things that I can be incorrect on, but I'm only too happy when somebody points it out, because even if I'm wrong about something, it's a win-win situation, because I now know something new. I can correct whatever mistake that I had made and take the new piece of information on board. So there's nothing to lose as far as I'm concerned. Whereas I don't think a lot of people feel like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's kind of like, I want to say like a stereotype of an ENTP can be, like they're just like people that just like correcting everyone, right? Because we're not necessarily we're willing to entertain all types of thoughts, ideas, and conversations. It's very, very instinctual for an ENTP to kind of just start poking, like, even if it's the first time we're talking about a subject and it's something that's, completely new to me, because I think I have some general principles of knowledge, and I can, identify, oh, well, I've never talked about the harbor before, but I can totally tell that's an inconsistency or that's a contradiction, right? And it's very instinctual for people, or for at least people like me, to point that out like right away and be like, oh, that, and then you kind of it's very easy to label you like a, you know, Mr. Correction, right? Like just somebody that likes correcting people. But what's funny is, and I don't think people understand, is if you do that to if you correct somebody that always corrects people, more likely than not, they would appreciate the correction.
Yeah, this is a great life lesson for people too. If you have a thinker in your life that you think gives you too many corrections, it's a kind of realization that they're okay with it themselves too. So you can give them the same thing that they give you, because they can take it.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and it can be hard. I mean, people, like, I think a part of who a person is, you know, is very much their opinions and the kind of person they see themselves to be. And sometimes when you challenge a belief that somebody has, I think, you know, it's part of a wall of many other beliefs, and oftentimes that particular one feeds into many other ones. And by challenging that particular belief, you're attacking multiple beliefs, and in many cases, probably the identity of the person as well. I think the difference is just someone like me isn't put out by that, because as far as I can tell, well, not as far as I can tell, as far as I'm concerned, my own identity comes from a desire to have correct information. That's built upon reasoning rather than opinions that I want to have because I like having certain opinions, if that makes sense.
Right.
So you can understand for people that it would be hard if the person you think you are and the beliefs that you have and cherish are being violated, I suppose, or challenged. You're going to be defensive and want to put up some kind of a resistance. Yeah, for me, it doesn't. If I can see very, very straightforwardly that some opinion that I had was factually incorrect, I have no problem letting it go. Like they don't have any more meaning than the fact that they're true, if that makes sense. I don't keep opinions because I like them or they're meaningful. I keep them because they make sense.
Right.
So it's no problem to let them go. Yeah.
Once they stop making sense,
they're gone. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the magic power of TI. If it's not the truth, it deserves to be destroyed by the truth. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you, James and Sebastian, for coming on and giving your perspectives. I really enjoyed our typing sessions together and getting to know you both. You both really help things make sense in the world. Yeah, we can always count on you to have clean logic. And you really help refine the algorithm of clean logic in the world. So we're not a bunch of walking hypocrites. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And I also love the well of philosophical knowledge that, you know, James, you bring to the table. You have a lot of theoretical knowledge you like to gather from books and through thinking by yourself. You like to come to your own understandings about things, and it's very replenishing. And your perspective is very, I don't know, like you cut through so many layers. Like your TI scalpel went 50 layers deep with understanding certain concepts. And it's very, very entertaining and like thought-provoking to hear your perspectives on the topics that you've thought a very long time on. Yeah, and Sebastian, I love your personableness. You do have like a winning smile. Like when you talk, you have this like really friendly smile, and you make people like want to be your friend, and you have that to you. So that's great. I really like hearing about how you'll critique shows and like see what doesn't make sense about them, and you'll go like, huh, does this plotline make sense? So you love to use your TI for fun sometimes to like just destroy movie plot lines. So I love that. I love that. The questioning that you both do really helps us refine our thinking and helps us become more critical thinkers. So I greatly appreciate that. And it's nice to have you two as my NT groupies. So I appreciate that as well. And thank you everyone for watching this episode.
thank you, Joyce, for having us.
Bye everyone.
Thanks, Joyce.